we are in Genesis chapter 11. Genesis 11. Periodically, some of my notes I will put down a date, but Usher dates this as about 2247 BC, 2247, in case you're interested. Okay, the primary historical incident that we've already finished up, in fact, would be the flood, and now we're on what's the history of the world after the flood. The people, of course, landed, the 8 souls that were with them in the ark, and of all those animals, etc. They landed on Mount Ararat and settled for a while there. I don't know how long they stayed. I have no idea. Your guess is as good as mine. But when they were leaving Ararat, they came to Shinar, S-H-I-N-A-R, which is pretty much, I'm not much of an artist, but here we've got the Mediterranean Sea. And then it kind of turns down here, and the river of Egypt, Nile, comes on down. But over here, we've got coming down like this, Tigris River and the Euphrates River, and it comes down into Chaldea, and almost down at the end down here is Ur of the Chaldees. This is where Abraham received his call to go to the land of promise, which was way back over here. Okay, in this regard, they came to, that area is called the Fertile Crescent, and this is the Gulf down here. This is where so much fighting occurs right now in today's world. That's a very important area since it empties into this Gulf, and people are constantly fighting to get control of it. Anyway, this area is basically known in the Bible as Mesopotamia. M-E-S-O-S means middle or in the midst. And Potamos is a Greek word for river. And so we have the area between the two rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates, is called Mesopotamia. And that's what we're dealing with right now. Of course, these names were not there in the original, except the river Euphrates. Euphrates River, that was a name of a river that flowed out of Eden, you remember? And it was also, of course, after the flood, the topography of the land was totally different. Mountainous areas, caverns, and so on. But some of those people evidently in the ark, whenever they got around to naming a river after the flood, it wasn't the same river, but they used that name anyway, evidently, and that name has stuck. It's still the Euphrates River. The other is the Tigris over to the left. All right, now, the immediate descendants of Noah all spoke the same language. I think a lot of this, instead of being historical, would have to be supposition. But, I mean, after all, God communicated with his people. How did he do it? By talking. Do this, do that. What language did he use? We don't know for sure. Probably it was a Semitic language. And I would guess probably Hebrew. But anyway, God was communicating with Adam before the flood, Noah before the flood, and then, of course, after the flood, they were still just one language. I'm assuming it's the same language that was there in the pre-flood antediluvian days. Here they are with one language, and that's an important factor because that more or less lays out the scenario of what's going to happen. Chapter 11, verse 1 says, "And the whole earth was of one language and one speech," literally of one lip, L-I-P, of one lip and one set of words, the language itself. Okay, now, Shinar is southeast of Arad, where the ark landed, southeast of there. And that tells me that they traveled a long way down to the south and east into the region, what is now Persia or even Afghanistan. But they traveled there, and then look at verse 2. "It came to pass, they journeyed from the east, and they found a plain there in Babylonia, in Shinar, and they decided to stay there." That's in chapter 11, Genesis 11, and verse 2. Shinar would be the lower plain of Babylonia. I would guess they probably thought, this has got to be like Eden. This is a great place to live. Let's just settle here. Okay. Verse 3, "They said to one another, 'Go to.'" How many of you have heard or seen that word before in the Bible? G-O and then T-O, go to. You wonder, what in the world does that mean? From my study, it seems like, and it's used even in the New Testament. 2, 3, or 4 times or more in the New Testament. Go to. Sort of like the expression we use today. Instead of go to, we say, "Come on now. Come now." Talking about the thing that had just been going on being rather ridiculous. So anyway, they intended to make a name for themselves. Here in Babylonia. "And they said to one another, 'Go to, let's make bricks, burn them thoroughly, bake them.' And they had brick for their stone, and slime they had for the mortar." What are they going to do? They're going to make a tower. Verse 4, "Go to, let's build us a city." Come on, let's build a city and a tower. 2 things, not just one. Tower, that came first evidently, and then the city later, and they were disrupted in doing that. But let's build a city and a tower whose top unto heaven. Now, why did I leave out two words? Well, look at your text. Whose top may reach unto heaven. What does that mean? That's in italics. There is no Hebrew term for may reach. Is that significant? Is that important? Probably. Because if there's no words for that, that means the writers, the translators of Hebrew into English, they substituted something that they figured probably what it meant. They're going to build a tower that actually goes to heaven. Some nowadays question that. They're not talking about actual tower trying to get to heaven, but they're going to build a tower that is so high, it's going to be used as a figurative expression here. It's a high tower. It's one that stretches toward heaven. But not that they thought they were actually going to build a tower that would go into heaven. Be that as it may, those ideas are out there. But their reason for building it is interesting. Look at the last part of verse 4. Let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the face of the earth. What did God give Noah as his instruction when they left the ark? Same thing he gave to Adam. Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. Now, this seems to be just the exact opposite of what God said to do, right? Instead of going out into all the world, let's settle down right here. Possibly that's what we have going on. Anyway, man's ideas versus God's ideas. That's as old as this book, and it's still happening today. For example, how many times have you heard discussions on Acts 2:38? Repent and be baptized, every one of you. Why? For remission of sins. Well, yeah, but our church doesn't teach that. Well, the question is, does the Bible teach it? Does God say that? Not, what do men think? And here, Nimrod and his crew had decided that, well, especially Nimrod, we know better than God. So don't pay attention to what God says, you listen to me. Somebody turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 28. Deuteronomy 1:28. Notice similarity of terminology here. Where shall we go up? Our brethren are discouraged. Our heart saying, the people is greater and taller than we. The cities are great. Those cities are walled up to heaven. Well, they knew better than that. They didn't go to heaven. The cities, in other words, they're tall. They have high walls and so on. That's the meaning of the term right here, walled up to heaven. And we've also seen the sons of the Anakims there. Later on, they were concerned with people that were extremely tall, giant-like. Anyway, I read that reference, and I thought, well, that ought to be considered when we're talking about this particular verse. So, In other words, what we have here is a statement like adjectives are used today. It simply means high, tall. Let's build a tall, gigantic, tall tower. Probably people today in our area might say, like the Devon Tower. And probably in a few years, they're going to say, boy, that new tower makes the Devon Tower short, because they're contemplating building probably the tallest tower I know in the United States. That's still on the books. But here, let's build a tower, let's settle down, let's stay here, regardless of what God has said. Okay, go with me to verse 5 now. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, two things, which the children of men had built. Does this mean that God didn't know what was going on and he had to come down and take a look at it? No, it doesn't mean that at all. This is another figurative expression. It's certainly not suggesting that God's not fully aware of what men are doing. He knew what men were doing down here on earth, just like he did before the flood. But now he is officially giving notice of taking the situation under direct observation and control. I'm here, he's watching what's going on, and he wants the whole world, including us, to know it. Not that he didn't know already, he was aware of it. So in verse 5, that statement, now the Lord came down to see what's going on. Usually, the Lord allows mankind, allows him to pursue his own ways without any interference on his part. Hundreds of years can go by, as we'll see in just a little bit, and we don't have any history of what went on at all. But notice the Lord, verse 5, is taking something under special consideration. What were besides the creation, what were some of the main areas where God intervened in the history of mankind? Well, the first one we just finished, the flood. The reason they'd become so morally rotten and every thought of their hearts was on evil continually, and God said, enough, that's enough. I'm going to bring a flood on the earth. And that helped for a while, but it didn't take long for sin to rear its ugly head again. And it's doing it here. So God is, like he did in the case of the flood, Noah. Here we have another incident where God is going to intervene in man's history. What does God do? Look at verse 6. The Lord said, behold, the people is one. They're united. They have all one language. And this is what they're going to do. And nothing now will be restrained from them. They can let their imaginations run wild. They're going to do whatever they want to do. Go to, he says. There's that third time that expression is used. Come on now, let us go down. Now mark, U.S., us. We've already seen that in the Bible. Back in Genesis, early part of Genesis, prior to the flood. But here, it's not let us make man in our image after our likeness. Here it is, let us go down. So, who's us? Well, we know at least three of them will be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But there's a council going to be taking place among the Godhead. Genesis 1:26 and chapter 3, verse 22, all those other two references where let us is found. But here in Genesis 11, it's talking about a different situation. It's not a flood. Now it's a tower that the people are building in direct rebellion to God's word and desire. In Psalm chapter 2 and verse 2, this statement is made. It sums up so well what we're seeing right now in Genesis 11. But Psalms 2 and verse 2 says, that shall the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord. Well, that's what's going on. Didn't make any difference what God said. Here's what we're going to do. In other words, it sounds a lot like mankind today. We don't care what the Bible says. We've made up our minds on that subject. Now, look at verse 8 and 9. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there upon the face of all the earth, and they left off, they forgot about, they stopped their building of the city. Probably they'd already finished the tower. Probably. But they stopped their building of the city. Therefore, the name of it is called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad on the face of all the earth. The Lord intervened. Incidentally, as far as we're concerned today, one of the greatest interventions the Lord has made came after this. We're talking about in the first century. For centuries, the prophecy of Christ coming into the world was there. People were talking about it even in the days of the New Testament. Is this the prophet that's supposed to come? Well, but they're talking about the prophecies of the Old Testament. Someone's coming. And yet that someone, we don't know that much about it. We do today because we have the New Testament, but they didn't know that much about it back then. But someone is coming, and that someone is the Messiah, as we know the Messiah, Christ, the Lord, the Son of God, intervened. God intervened within the history of man and sent his Son, born of a virgin, another miracle. So we've got these three interventions at least, major interventions. The latter, the greatest one as far as we're concerned. Now, he confounded the language of the people. I would have loved to have been a fly on a wall back then, just to hear and to see what was going on for myself. My imagination, I don't want to run wild with it, but I can imagine some people getting very, very upset. What are they doing? They're building a city. That means somebody's got to be in control. There are the workers, and then there are the foremen. Probably Nimrod was one of them, maybe the main one. Can you imagine hundreds of people out here working? You go and pick up these stones and bring them over here, and you all make some mud-like bricks and bring them here, and all of a sudden they start babbling. Yeah, blah, blah. What? What'd you say? All of a sudden, their language is confounded. They can't communicate with each other. The foremen, the ones giving the orders, instructions to their crews, they couldn't get the message across. The crew, the men, the workers, didn't understand what he was saying. Maybe they thought that he's just making fun of us because he doesn't like the work we're doing. I can imagine they became very, very agitated with each other. Maybe they found it impossible to get the servants to carry out the commands, like Nimrod might be saying to some of the servants, you go punish these people and do something to them. And they themselves refuse to follow Nimrod's orders. We've got rebellion breaking out all over the land here. Yes, God intervened. Finally, there was nothing to do except just separate. And that's what we have. Their language, verse 9 says they were scattered. How were they scattered? They were scattered by family, becoming a tribe, maybe to themselves. But they all began to move out and away from Babylon. These are interesting happenings, and we'd like to know more about it. At least I would. I can imagine. I think that would make a good movie if somebody wanted to let their imaginations run wild. But anyway, the families left, stuck together because of similar language. One, this language over here, another language here. Obviously, that's a miracle. But God did it. And those families began to pack their goods, preparing for a trip somewhere. They left Babel. And the last memory of them probably, well, look at verse 9. Therefore, that is, because of this, because of what? Because they couldn't understand each other and there was just babbling going on. Because of this, the Lord confounded their language and they scattered. And that's the last that we know about Babel. Incoherent language or words pouring out of the lips of their people that once had been their own relatives, maybe distant relatives. So they all began to leave, and therefore the name is called Babel, because there the Lord did confound their language. Okay, chapter 11, verse 10. Notice the difference in style here. That's the incident of Babel, verses 1 through 9. Starting in verse 10, see that paragraph notation right after the word number 10. New paragraph. These are the generations of Shem. And you can look and see for yourself from here till the next from 10 to about verse 24, 25, we've got another genealogy written down for us. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I'll make mention of a few things that I've considered to be important. Generation of Shem means what? That goes right back to Noah's 3 boys. Noah on the ark. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they were on the ark. They had their wives with them. So now Shem, apparently, and I stress that word, apparently, had kept the record historical record of genealogies from Genesis chapter 10, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 9, probably. But notice verse 10 says, these are the generations of Shem. He was 100 years old. He begat Arphaxad. He had a boy by the name of Arphaxad who was born 2 years after the flood. What happened during those 2 years? All we know is what we read right here. The history was not recorded, but the genealogy was. Okay, so he was born 2 years after the flood. The one that I want to focus on, though, is, and I'm going to jump on down to about verse 24. Nahor, now this is not Abraham's son, for those of you who know this history. This is not, this Nahor is the father of Terah. And so the Nahor that we know more about is he's related to, well, Abraham's brother. But this Nahor in the first one, verse 24, is granddad to the other Nahor. Nahor, verse 24, begat Terah. Terah had 3 boys. Well, at least we have them recorded here. Verse 26. Terah lived 70 years, and he begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. One of his boys he named after his own daddy, or Grandpa Nahor, and grandson Nahor are both mentioned here. Long years passed. Look at verse 25. Nahor lived after he begat Terah. He lived 119 years and begat sons and daughters. If there's anything like people today, and I assume that is the case, we probably have about as many daughters that he had begotten, just as about as many as you have men or boys that he has begotten. The world they're taking care of what God said. Multiply, replenish, fill the earth. Now Genesis 10:1 through 11:9 cover the descendants of Ham and Japheth, Noah's other 2 boys besides Shem, Ham and Japheth. And then they're covered through the 3rd generation down. But Ham Shem, his generation is covered 6 generations down instead of just 3. So Shem is covering a greater or longer period of time. And the account was taken up then evidently by Terah, writing down a lot of this information. Terah was in the 9th generation, 3 generations further on yet, 9th generation after the flood. And here's some more ages that you might be interested in. Shem lived until after Terah had died. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem lived a long time. He lived after Terah had died. So that gave Terah plenty of time to talk with Shem, get the family records from him, and he probably was the one that was doing the recording of all this. And note also that even Noah lived. Noah was still alive until Terah was 128 years old. So they lived together that long, Noah and Terah. Those are extremely long years that those people lived, but we're going to see in a little bit, they began to plunge. Their longevity, how long they lived, was much, much shorter. Okay, now, starting in verse 12, you have a bunch of these right on through 17. When you compare Genesis 5 and that genealogy with Genesis 11 and this genealogy, you'll see that ages of people began to decline tremendously after the flood. For example, Noah lived 950 years, almost as long as Methuselah. He lived 950 years. But Shem, his boy, lived 600. Over 300 years less. Arphaxad, his son, lived 438. Salah, S-A-L-A-H, lived 433. Eber, just 464. And after Peleg, it really begins to drop off. To me, this is fascinating material, and you don't gather some of that just by reading it quickly and say, okay, I read chapter 5 and chapter 11. You have to compare verses, come up with points like this that are, to me, extremely interesting. One point I made many Sundays ago was about the water vapor canopy that surrounded the earth, and it kept the earth watered. Plant life was abundant everywhere. That's before the flood. When God brought the flood, not only did that come down, but fountains of the deep came up and brought about all this water that covered the earth. But that water vapor canopy doesn't exist anymore after the flood. It is dissipated. It is emptied. And so that means that a lot of your mutations that are going on today had their beginning. We didn't have any instructions on intermarrying relatives before. But we read from Moses' writings that it was not right. God did not permit the close intermarrying of relatives because of problems with mutations. So what that's going to cause also the aging process to really begin to accelerate, really begin to take off. They're going to age a lot faster after the flood, much, say, hundreds of years after the flood. They're aging a lot faster than they do now. How many of you, for example, have seen, I can't think of the name of it, maybe you know, Kenneth, seems like it's related to the word geriatrics or something like that, but a little boy, let's say 7 or 8, 9 years old, look at his face and he looks like he's 80 years old. What do they call that? Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot. But they have. I've seen some of those pictures of little kids. They die young, but they look like they're 70 to 80 years old when they died. They age extremely fast. Well, that's the point I'm making. Because of mutations and so on, you have a lot of problems with the aging process. Peleg is mentioned here. He was born 101 years after the flood. Where we are right now in Genesis, talking about after the flood, they're scattered and so on. Peleg, of course, is one of those mentioned. He died 101 years after the flood, which is probably about the time of their scattering after the Tower of Babel. So for 100 years, we don't have much in the way of history, except the world was getting worse and worse. Okay, Genesis chapter 11, verse 18 through 25. Well, 24 brings us down to Nahor. He was 29 years old when he begat Terah. Well, wait a minute. He lived 9 and 20 years, and begat Terah. Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119, and he begat sons and daughters. Terah, though, is where you really want to pick up the Bible record. Why? Because we're following the genealogy of Jesus Christ right on down to the time of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. So Terah, in verse 26, lived 70 years, and he begat those three boys, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And I don't think that Abram was the oldest. Anybody know more than that? I think he was younger than the oldest child. We'll see in a minute. Somehow, Terah knew that he was supposed to keep the patriarchal records that he got from Shem. And he completed his assignment of keeping those records with verse 27. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot, and then he starts with a few more here. So, the next writer, and this is a guesswork, but could have been Isaac, according, let's look at Genesis 25, verse 19. But the next writer might have been Isaac. He picks up the translation or the writing here in verse 27b, tying his record now with the record that he received right back to Terah and the name of his three boys. How did he get them? Probably from Abraham. Notice Abram left, we'll find out later, Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees with his daddy Terah, went up north to Haran, Genesis 12 and 4, and then in view of the fact that Terah seems to have become an idolater in later years, we'll talk about that more next Lord's Day. You can read Joshua 24 verses 2 and 3 for yourself. But Terah seems to have become an idolater. So, more than likely, that came from Abraham right on down to Isaac, who is going to be keeping them. But Haran died. One of those three boys, the Terahs, died while he was less than 135 years old. And his father was still living when he died. Well, Haran apparently had visited his daddy, Terah, back home in Ur of the Chaldees. He must have gone back for a visit. He left one son there, who Haran did, and he became attached to his uncle Abraham. And so we get that close connection right there, trying to put some of the things together and assuming some of the others. Nahor married his niece. That's still going on. Look at Milcah, verse 29. He married the daughter of Haran. And so he gives that information, and then look at the word, verse 30, the first word, but. These people got married, they married their relatives and so on, but Sarah was barren and had no child. He's laying the groundwork for another important story. We'll pick up there next week.